All right, you ready, Jack?
Yep.
So thank you all for being here virtually. Um, this is quite an interesting situation. Um, so Jack comes to us from Juniata College. He was a biology major, and he joined both the biological sciences department and the multi-steps IGRT program. So Jack was one of our inaugural class of students in general. He, as that program transitioned into biotrans, he stayed with the program as well. So he will be a biotrans graduate too. Now, Jack has had quite a journey. So you should know that he actually spent a number of years working on a different PhD project. He has done an immense amount of work. So switching over into a project solely on bird flight was not really by choice. If Jack could do it all over again, he would probably say, all right, I'll be happy to blaze through here and be done, 2 years ago. But I think that his ability to switch over into this new project and get it done in a relatively efficient way, I think is a testament to both his character and his work ethic and his abilities overall. And I would like to say some of the data that he's going to show you from these birds, he has recorded it from a number of different cameras. And in doing so, you have to digitize points in each camera. And so this is hundreds of points times hundreds and hundreds of videos. This is an immense amount of work. So you don't really fully appreciate the scope of the amount of work that went into it. So I just wanted to express that to you because Jack probably won't. Now, a few more things about him. So Jack is from Texas and he grew up a lifelong Spurs fan, which is really great because he's one of the few people in the lab who can understand my sports analogies. Most people are like, half the lab is like, Spurs, oh, are we talking about horses? So we're not only going to miss Jack in spirit, but we are actually going to miss him in body, simply because Jack could reach things in the highest shelf of the lab, which is great. So now we're not in person, so I can't really illustrate this. So this is a very visual thing. So instead, I tried to find a picture of Jack and myself together to illustrate this point. I couldn't find one, so this one is just representative. So let me share that with you. So that's what Jack and I look like together. All right, I think that's enough of that. Okay, so with that, I'd like to introduce Jack Whitehead, and the platform is yours.
Okay, thank you. I need to do this. Okie doke. Yeah, Jake, thank you very much for that introduction. And so, as hopefully many of you know at this point, I'm going to be talking about how mallards land on water today. So to start out, when we think about landing and birds can do a couple different things. In particular, we typically think of songbirds, and they're going to come in and land on a perch, normally a branch. And so we can think of these as varying degrees of compliance, but they're going to be landing on a substrate that can shift or absorb some degree of the weight, but it is largely a solid substrate. In addition, a lot of these songbirds can also land on very non-compliant surfaces like a rock. And in this case, this is a great to actually landing vertically on a rock wall, and they can grasp those. And so they have a lot of variability in this ability to land on these solid substrates. However, there is also a large group of birds that land on fluid surfaces, particularly waterfowl, and in this case, a mallard duck. One of the interesting things, though, about waterfowl is that if that surface that is usually fluid changes to, say, ice, we know errors can occur. And so this implies that the type of substrate may matter to how these birds regulate and control their landings. So if we back up a little bit and just think really broadly about what birds need to do to land. So here we have a pigeon approaching this perch. And so as it approaches this perch, it needs to do a couple things. It needs to be able to detect the changing distance to the substrate where it's going to land. It also needs to be able to land with kinematics that avoid injury or enable it to retain some level of control over the impact forces as it lands. And the behavior throughout needs to be flexible enough to be able to adapt to changes, because the natural world is generally a bit cluttered and noisy and things can occur. So they need to be able to adapt to potential changing conditions to have safe landings. So very simply, this is a GIF that is taking advantage of the fact that we see very similarly to birds using optic flow. So this is moving the image along your retina, and the rate at which that moves is a way to detect motion. And we know pigeons and a lot of other birds do this as well. So this is part of that first question. How do they detect the change of that substrate? And so optic flow is integral to that initially. However, it doesn't explain how they actually use the information from optic flow to regulate their approach. And so there has been some work on this. And so there's some evidence that what they do is they actually use the distance to the perch and optic flow to get the rate of change of distance, their velocity in that direction. And so instead of regulating either one of these parameters, they're actually going to regulate this parameter tau, which is a ratio of the two. And so as the bird approaches the perch, they're going to update this system, and they're actually going to maintain a value of tau throughout that approach. Next, we also know there's been some kinematic work on pigeons, and so we know that generally they're going to come in at relatively low velocities, and they're actually going to make contact with the perch at relatively steep angles at impact, though they will approach it fairly laterally to get there. And last, there's been some work that shows, well, that you can put an artificial forest in a lab, and pigeons can maneuver around these obstacles to get to the perch. So there's a degree of flexibility in what they can do during their approach for these landings. In addition, we actually know that slow flight, which is related to landing and takeoff, as well as landing, is relatively well studied in perch landing. So for instance, there's some really good work on looking at the wing and tail kinematics as planes in particular for landing and takeoff. There also is some really interesting work actually looking at the pressure generated by the wings during slow flight maneuvers. And there's also a lot of really interesting work on the kinematics of how pigeons in particular create sharp turns or banks. And all these can be done in the laboratory. And all of this work has really led to a lot of pushes for bioinspiration. So for instance, this is a fixed wing airfoil, and what it is actually doing is it is perching on that rock wall. And those two little white points on the front are actually claw deployments that function similar to how that great tit was grasping the rock wall earlier. However, when it comes to how birds land on water, we really don't know very much. There's only one study, and it's on a red-throated loon. And so they looked at both takeoff and landing on the surface of the water. And so they got some good information showing that these guys do what is termed a skidder, where they're going to run on the water and flap their wings, so it's aerial assisted. And once they get up to about 10 meters per second, they can get full takeoff. And they also showed some really good qualitative work on the form and angles with which these birds approach landing on the surface of the water, but they unfortunately didn't get enough footage to get good quantitative metrics of landing behavior in these birds. So one of the differences between this study and the others that I've highlighted in perch landing is this one was done at a pond in the field. And part of the reason for that is that it is actually very difficult to get these birds to do these types of landings on water in a laboratory, which is one of the reasons there isn't as much work in that area. To illustrate this a bit better, so this is actually a video of a common loon, not a red-throated one, and they actually come in and land on their breasts. So they come in at relatively high velocity and they're going to skim for a while. So creating a tank in a lab, as well as the airspace to enable a bird to do this type of landing accurately is very constraining. This is also true even with smaller ducks to some degree. So this is a bufflehead duck, and they land more like how we imagine a bird to land. They're going to land feet first, but this guy's still going to skim across the water like he's water skiing for a bit. This just kind of illustrates part of the problem with getting at this question. And so we actually were going to go out into the field and use some techniques people have been developing to take these types of kinematic recording techniques into the field to look at the animals. And to do that, we wanted to look specifically at 3 different questions. So we wanted to look at how mallards regulate the kinematics with which they land on water, what kinematics they actually are landing on with water to actually quantify that. And we also wanted to look at this potential ability for plasticity. So can they shift their landing behavior due to the presence or absence of obstacles? So to start, we're just going to look at this first one. So how are they regulating those kinematics when they land on water? They're using optic flow, they following the same strategy. And in particular, do they follow the same tau dot constant breaking strategy, which has been shown in pigeons? So if we go back to this idea of tau theory and regulating tau, so as this pigeon approaches again, it's going to regulate these 2 variables to create this parameter tau. However, when you track an animal's behavior, what actually turns out is they tend to regulate tau by keeping the rate of its change constant. So you get this constant breaking coefficient in relation to tau as the bird goes through the landing. So that seems to be the strategy with which they use, and so it's termed a tau dot constant breaking strategy. So what this means is we can actually look at the kinematics of how a bird lands, and if we can calculate tau from those kinematics, so we have the distance to where it runs into the substrate over the rate of change of that distance, then that parameter tau should be linear with respect to time to impact. If it's not, then they're not regulating tau in the same way. So Lee, who proposed tau theory, has done this with several animals. He did this with pigeons. And so each one of these red lines is the tau with respect to impact. So you can see time to impact on the x-axis and tau on the y. And you can see these are somewhat linear, and the mean Pearson linear coefficient shows that. And you can also calculate the slopes for each one of those. You can get a mean tau dot, get an idea of what this constant that they might be trying to maintain is, which in this case for pigeons is about 0.775. He also has done similar work on bats, and they do something similar as well. And they're also around 0.7 for a tau dot. And also hummingbirds, and they also have a similar mean tau dot. So one of the interesting things about this idea of a constant breaking strategy is if you model it, it actually means that you're generating certain specific behaviors. So if you have a tau dot less than 0.5, an agent will stop before the collision. If it's greater than 0.5, you're actually going to decelerate into the collision. So you're going to run into the object or substrate, but you're going to be decelerating, so potentially limiting those impact forces you're going to have to deal with. And if it's greater, you're going to be accelerating into the collision to some degree. So we can then plot where the tau dots for each one of these animals falls on the spectrum. And you can see what makes sense since these animals are landing. They're grasping that substrate, and so they are running into it. And so it's a controlled collision. And so that is where we expect most landing behaviors to fall. So to look at this in mallards, we filmed this at a local pond on campus in Blacksburg. And so each one of those colored triangles is a GoPro camera on a tripod. And each one of them also has a radio, which we use to send sound pulses through, which allows us to look at all the videos from the GoPros, and then we can synchronize them based on those sound pulses. So we're looking at the same point in time in each camera afterwards. So then to do this type of kinematic work, we need to know the volume of interest is what we call it. We need to know what that area looks like. And so what we did is we used Argus, which is a digitizing and calibrating software. And we can track that odd thing I'm holding in my hands in that photo with the 2 giant red balls, which we just call a wand. And so what that is it is an object of known size. And I will walk through the whole volume of interest in that water with that wand, and we can then digitize those 2 points. And so in all the views of all the cameras, we know what the actual distance between those 2 points is, but in each camera, it will not appear to be that exact length because of the different perspectives you see and the different angles the wand is at. And so we can use those differences to back calculate the whole volume in 3 dimensions. And then any bird, or mallard in this case, that flies to the area, we can digitize a point on the duck and find out where that is in space in 3D coordinates. So in this case, we digitize the point where the neck meets the body. We did that because it's easy to see due to their posture, as you can see in this for most of the landings, but also on the males, which are the higher percentage of birds in the area, there's a very clear plumage mark as well, which made this an easy point to digitize. In addition, after you have these tracks, you can have a number of them. There are occasionally gaps. So this occurs when, for instance, the wings, due to flapping, covers this point on the bird we're trying to digitize, or sometimes the background colors merge too much with the bird and it gets too difficult to see where it is for a short period of time. And so we use what's called a Kalman filter to interpolate these gaps. So what this does is this takes previous points where we can see this point, and he uses those position and actually the velocity and acceleration, which we can calculate, we can extract out of that position to interpolate where the bird should go based on that to fill in those gaps. And then we can smooth the kinematics using a Butterworth filter, which allows us to customize each trajectory based on the amount of noise detected within the digitization of that landing. So at the end, we had 177 landings, and this is what the 3D trajectory plots of each one of those landings looks like. You can see they come in from lots of different directions, and they hit the water and go out in all sorts of different directions because we're in the field. And so this is not very useful in this way. And so what we did is we actually processed this data a little bit by rotating each trajectory to align it with where it was going initially. And so this put the X and Y axes essentially into one axis. So we can then plot each of these trajectories in 2D. So then what we did is we transformed the trajectories so that everything is oriented relative to initial impact. And initial impact here is a little bit above that waterline you see in the graph, because since we're tracking where the neck meets the body, that is always above the water at initial impact because the feeder tail is always hitting the water first. And then last, we actually truncated the beginning of these trajectories a little bit based on when the birds initially start having a downward velocity with regard to space. And so that let us ensure that we're looking at largely landing behaviors. And we can split this up into a landing approach and a skim feature. So once you do all of that, this is what all those 177 landings look like, which is much more manageable. And we can see really clearly, we have this nice x-axis from which we can actually calculate are the features we need for tau, the distance to that point of initial impact at 0 and the rate of change of that distance for each time point for each trajectory. So with that, we can calculate tau for these mallards. And if you plot that relative to time to impact, so that again is on the X and tau is on the Y. And you can see there's a bit more variation. We also have a bit longer landings in general here compared to the behavior Lee has looked at. But you can see we still have a high degree of linearity, and the tau dots are actually around 0.9 in this case. So if we go back to this idea of where we put tau dots on the spectrum, we would expect a mallard to be in controlled collision because it's still a landing behavior, and they largely are. They're at 0.9, but if you look at that standard deviation and the range, we actually have some of these mallards who are landing a little bit past 1. These are actually not distinctly different kinematically. We have run that, but they are landing with tau dots above 1. This may be because most of them are not much beyond 1, a feature where they're holding a constant velocity as opposed to greatly accelerating into the water. But it seems to suggest that they're not breaking as much. In addition, we can plot again the pigeons and then also the hummingbirds and the bats on here. And so these are all also capable of powered flight and increased braking, just like our mallards, but they all appear to be somewhat lower on the tau dot spectrum. In addition, there's been a recent study on Draco lizards, which is a gliding lizard, and they looked at how it lands on tree trunks and how its tau behaves. And so this guy is not capable of powered flight like the rest on this plot. But his tau dot is slightly higher, and the mallards still exceed him, but the mallards also have a greater variation. But regardless, this seems to suggest that the mallards may be using a higher tau dot when landing on water, which suggests a bit of decreased braking compared to what they could be doing compared to the other powered flyers in this case. But very specifically, the mallards do appear to very clearly be using this same tau dot constant approach that we see in perch landing behavior. So we've looked at how they're regulating these kinematics. So next we want to look at what the actual kinematics are for how these birds are landing on water. And in particular, we want to try and get an idea of what are the main drivers of particular this distance after you hit the water, the distance skimmed. And so if we think about each one of these trajectories, again, what you're looking at is we have the split in two phases. So we have an approach for which we can collect a number of kinematics. So we can get the vertical impact velocity, the horizontal impact velocity, the impact angle, as well as the mean approach angle. And so the mean approach angle is actually the mean of all the velocity vector angles for that whole approach phase up until initial impact. Then we can also calculate the distance the bird travels after impact. So with this information from the trajectories that we tracked, we can extract all these kinematic parameters. And so in particular, I just want to highlight a few things on this compared to what we looked at previously with pigeons that has been studied on perch landing, who have a maximum horizontal impact velocity of about 2 meters per second. The mean for these mallards is almost 5, and the upper end of the range is a little over 8 meters per second. So these guys are landing at much higher speeds on the water than we see in perch landing. And they also tend to have shallower impact angles. So if you remember that impact angle for pigeons tends to be somewhere between 50 and 80 degrees. And here our maximum is just below 60 degrees. And we have a mean impact angle of 15 degrees. So we do see a bit of shallowing of these kinematics in comparison, as well as higher speeds. However, in particular, this distance after impact feature is useful here because you can think of this as a resultant kinematic compared to the other 4. And so we can compare each one of these kinematic features to the distance after impact. So in all the figures I'm about to show you, distance after impact is always going to be on the y. And for now, we have vertical impact velocity on the x. And so you can see that as descent speeds decrease, so as they increase, actually, because we're negative here, we're getting less distance traveled. So if you're going down faster, you're actually not going to travel as far after impact. And if you're increasing your horizontal impact velocity, you're going to correspondingly increase your distance after impact. If you do come in with a shallower angle, you're more likely to travel further after impact. And if you have a generally more shallow approach angle, you're more likely to go further after impact. But if we want to look at this more specifically, we can plug this into a general linear model where the distance after impact is the resultant feature. And when you do that, you can see that the vertical impact velocity, despite having a relationship from a straight regression in this multi-regression analysis, is not a big contributor, a significant contributor to this distance after impact. And so that leaves us with these 3 more key kinematic features with regard to distance after impact. However, right now, we have looked largely at this approach feature of landing, but we haven't really looked at this transition. So when we think about the skim, there is this brief window right at initial impact when the feet and tail have hit the water, but before the breast has touched the surface of the water. And the breast is potentially a big influencer of how far a bird skims because it's going to be a big potential drag and lift surface once that breast hits the water. So we wanted to try and get a better look at what was going on in this transition. So we set up a second camera system. And so this is called a rotational stereo videography rig. And so what it is, it uses a mirror array to reflect an image back in to a camera which you can put a larger lens on. We didn't need one quite as large as the people who developed this one. But you can see on the bottom, the one we devised, and Ira there helped me troubleshoot for a summer for a long time. So what this does is this allows us to track relative position of points on the duck to itself. Because there is a bit of movement of the array itself from rotating the tripod, we cannot actually get the velocity of the bird, for instance, relative to the shoreline or the water, but we can track these points relative to each other within this system. And so this is a bit of what that footage looks like. And so you can see there's a little bit of horizontal panning to make sure we keep it in frame, but it lets us get closer to the bird to examine those points on the body and track them in relation to each other. So from this footage, we can get two kinematic features. So we can look at the duration of this transition. So we can actually just look at how long it takes a given bird to lower its breast into the water. And we can also look at the range of motion of the body, this main part of the breast. So we can find this initial angle relative to the horizontal, which is parallel to the water, and see if that initial posture is having an impact on how far a bird skims after impact. Also of note, since we can't get global position to compare this to distance after impact, we had to deal with a subset of data because every landing that we could use had to be in the rotational stereo videography rig as well as the previous GoPro videos that we were already collecting. So we added the second system, and anywhere landings were in both, we could do these additional analyses on. So that limits the number we have, but with this fewer subset, we can still look at the potential for relationships to distance after impact. And the big thing here is you can see for the body range, there is no obvious relationship distance after impact, but there is for transition duration. So the longer it takes a bird to lower their breast into the water, the more likely they are to travel further after impact. Again, with this subset, we can approach this from a general linear model perspective. And the interesting thing about this is when you run it this time with a subset, the only feature that is a significant contributor to distance after impact is your horizontal impact velocity. So this appears to be really the primary driver of this system, as long as you're worrying about how far the bird travels after impact. But we have these three kinematic parameters now that appear to be the main ones based on both general linear models that are contributing to this type of distance after impact. But there is some level, it's acceptable for multilinear regression analysis, but there's some level of collinearity between these. So there's a relationship there. And so we wanted to see if those relationships created kinematic profiles, which may contribute to different types of landing consistently. So if a bird's coming in for impact, for instance, a very simple way is these three kinematics may be related to, for instance, a shallower approach or a steeper approach consistently in certain ways that creates certain styles or types of landings. To try and get at this idea, we used a principal component analysis between these three key kinematic variables. So what we have on the x-axis is the mean approach angle in this case, and the horizontal impact velocity. So we're just dealing with two as an example to illustrate how a PCA or principal component analysis works. So what this does is it looks for key axes or principal axes of variation. So for instance, this could be one principal axis of variation, and this could be another within this data set. And so then what it's going to do is we're going to replot this data after normalizing based on those axes of variation on a new set of axes. And so you can do these for up to 3 principal axes within a data set and across as many variables as you wish. And so we did it for 3 principal axes on these 3 kinematics. This is what that distribution looks like. So again, each one of these, PC1, PC2, and PC3 are principal axes of variation within the broader data set. But that means each one of those axes is going to contain a bit of the variation of each kinematic parameter. It's not going to be made up of a single one altogether. So what we can kind of see here is actually we can do a clustering algorithm as well. And there is a bit of a difference here within this scatter. So when you are lower on that first principal axis variation, there's a feature where a lot of the landings are much more consistent to each other. And then on the right, as you move higher on that first principal axis, you see not really a consistent trend, but a lot of increased variation along the other 2 axes of variation within this data set, right? And so because this first group is more consistent with each other and they make up the majority, 119 of 177 of the landings we had, we call this typical. So as this is potentially a more common or typical landing behavior. And we call the rest of these 58 landings atypical because it's the opposite of typical. So if we go back and look at how each one of these kinematic variables relates to distance after impact, we can plot them using these groupings. And so you can see, based on the horizontal impact velocity on the left and the impact velocity on the right, and then the bottom left is mean approach angle, that these groupings are consistent, but also that these atypical landings do tend to be slower and steeper, is the kinematics that they take. And in addition, if we just think about the potential reason for that, it might be that there is variable numbers of waterfowl in the area, and so you could deal with crowding. And so if we just count the number of waterfowl around for each one of these landings, we actually see the distribution between those groups is slightly different, and that typical does have a lower mean, which is suggestive that the reason for these slightly different types of landings may be an avoidance type behavior dealing with crowding on the pond. So if we go back to these three kinematics, though, there is one additional interesting feature. So if you look at these coefficients, this represents the degree of variation in distance after impact we have potentially explained through these three variables, and it only represents about 26%. So a lot of what is potentially going on in this distance after impact is not actually explained by these three approach kinematics. So what else could potentially be going on? So again, if we go back to this diagram, there's a whole nother section of it we haven't even really looked at. We have approach and transition, but after that transition, there is the skim itself. And so during this skim, the bird does not have to be completely passive. They can be changing their center of mass. They could be adjusting fluid drag on the body through the use of feathers and or muscles. And they also could potentially be paddling their feet, which we can't see with the current setup. So all these things could be features that are attributing to this variation that we can't account for at this time in this study. So now that we've looked at what the birds are doing when they land on water and we can quantify that, we want to look at what the end of that thing suggests between typical and atypical and how there might be different types of landings, in particular that it may be in response to crowding at the pond. So are they shifting their behavior in response to the increased presence of other ducks, which are potential obstacles at the pond? So we wanted to go back to the video is how we did this, and we needed to look at the number of waterfowl and their position in the vicinity. So to give you an idea, this is an example of a landing. Those two big trees on the right, you're actually going to see two birds come in through there, and they're going to land. And you can see they land over the heads of a number of ducks. Ducks are moving a bit. They're all over the place on the pond. And so if we just look at the moment of impact for this female here in the bottom left, what we did is we just went to these moments of impact initially, and we went and we digitized all the other birds we could see. And so there are more in this given frame that we would have digitized. This is just an example of how that would work. So with this information, we can then look at the pond from above. And so each one of those green dots is the position of one of those birds. And where the mallard is and where it is heading is denoted by the red X and red arrow. And then we did, based on the position of all the other birds, we can do a bivariate kernel density plot, which just highlights density. So the deeper blues suggest there's a higher concentration of those birds, and the lighter birds, or fewer birds, is a lighter blue. And this just helps us visually portray this a bit better. The water is larger than the area of blue shown here. But you can see there's a decent amount of variation. So in this case, the mallard lands outside of the flock, is going away from it. However, sometimes the bird's landing in the midst of the flock, and it appears to be going towards a lot of the other birds in the area. And then sometimes you get something in between. So we needed a better way to look at this type of information. And right at this point, we were just pulling all of the birds we could see in all the videos. And so we wanted to standardize what birds were considered to be in the vicinity. So we created a limited landing area around each mallard. And then we also went on to identify a landing strip within that landing area. And so we based these on the kinematic data we already had on the landing of mallards. So the landing area was identified based on the maximum distance skimmed by a given mallard, which is a little over 6 meters. And the angle of the landing strip around the heading is based on the standard deviation of the deviation from heading from initial impact to the end of a skim. So that occasionally there are slight curves to these skims. And so if you take the end point of a skim versus initial impact, you can find an angle between that end point and the heading. These are generally quite slight, but it gives us a range at which to identify a bird as potentially going to curve into based on its initial heading. So we can identify that landing strip. So when we do this, we are also diminishing the area. So we need to keep track of just the number of individuals present in these distributions and the occurrence of that as we make these adjustments to the area in which we're looking for other birds, right? So this is just all of it that we could see in the camera. So of 177 landings, there's only one video in which there is not at least one other bird on the camera that's already in the water. When we shrink it to the landing area, we actually don't lose that many landings. We still have 165 landings in which there is at least another bird in the landing area. And then last, we can look at the landing strip. And this is where you suddenly see a dramatic change. Suddenly, there are only 5 landings that even have another potential obstacle or bird within that landing strip. So if we look at those landings a bit more in detail, we would like to look at a correlation regression here, but with only 5 points and all of them piled in 0, as you can see on the left, there's no real obvious relationship because of that. But you can see there's still a number of individuals. They're not super high compared to the amounts we've seen previously, where there are potentially 15 other birds around, but we're dealing with a smaller area, but you still have one in which there are 7. If we look at these a bit closer, though, we can look not just at the number of individuals, but we can look at the distance to the nearest neighbor. So how close is that nearest potential obstacle? And that's plotted on the x-axis there. And then we can plot distance after impact again on the y. And that green line is actually a 1-to-1 ratio. And so what that means is if a dot is on that line or near it, that bird is actually skimming to really close proximity with that nearest neighbor. If the point is way above on the upper left-hand side of this graph, that would suggest the bird is skimming dramatically past that nearest neighbor, which we could think of as a higher risk of an actual dangerous collision in a skim. And if it's substantially below in the lower right half, that would mean that they're not going anywhere near that nearest neighbor. And so there's a low chance of collision for their actual behavior. And so you can see here that generally these 5 birds are, even if there are other birds in the area, they're going near that other individual or less. But we don't really see anyone substantially going past that nearest neighbor, which is suggestive this may be a feature of birds are trying to avoid running into that individual because they're avoiding those high speed velocity skims past their nearest neighbor in this case. However, if we think about these distributions, so for instance, example here, it's not impossible that this type of landing result and lower number of birds in the area is simply by chance. So if you were to randomly pick another heading angle for this series, say here, there's a decent chance that there's no individual in it. And actually for this one in particular, there's a whole array of those, right? And so we really wanted to make sure that what we're looking at was not just a result of the birds randomly landing on the water and therefore avoiding having other birds within the landing strip. So how we did this was we ran 2 simulations. And so we created a distribution of random angles between 1 and 360. And we simply went through all of the 177 landing events, like this one shown on the left, and we assigned it one of these angles from this distribution. And so what we could do, if we look at several of these landing events, we could do that for each one. And so this allows us to create simulated landings and rerun the analysis of whether or not there is another bird present within that landing strip. And we can run that simulation 1,000 times and then get a mean for each landing event of how many birds are in that landing strip. And so this can give us an idea of if the birds were landing randomly, this is how often we would expect to see birds in a landing strip for each one of these events. So then to follow that up, we also did one where we use just heading angles actually performed by the mallards. And so this is the distribution of the angles of all the landing events that we recorded, the 177. And we could do the same thing. So we could pull one of these heading angles and reassign it to an event that it was not actually done at, right? And so we could do this as well. And so in this case, a little different, and we're essentially shuffling the heading angles of headings we actually observed at the pond. So for instance, this heading on the bottom left might be shuffled to the one on the top left. And the one on the right might get shuffled to the bottom left, and the one on the top left might be shuffled to the right. So again, we're simulating new landings, but instead of random angles, these are actual angles that other ducks performed at different times at the pond. And so we can run both of these 1,000 times and get these average number of individuals in the landing strip for each landing event, which can give us these frequency distributions. And so the shuffle results simulation is shown in blue and the random is in orange. And with a little transformation, we can show that these are distinct distributions, and also that the shuffle does have fewer individuals in the landing strip for a given landing event. So this really suggests that the headings these mallards are performing are not random, and it does lead to fewer potential obstacles within that landing strip. So from this, we know that mallards do appear to be limiting their ability to run into dangerously other individuals within the landing strip. And we know that the headings are not random. And so this suggests there's a benefit here, but as a result of the way this simulation works, we actually don't know if it's due to an individual mallard doing this behavior. So, right, since we have shuffled all of these headings, this is no longer a landing event specific feature. And so this may be an emergent property of how the group behavior of the duck occurs at this specific site, or it may be a broader emergent behavior of how ducks move in general, creating clear lanes, in which case these birds are going to land in. So, but in the end, again, we are seeing that it does do better than random in this case. So they are avoiding these obstacles. It's just unclear based on the results of the simulation whether that's an active choice by the bird that is landing. So we have now looked at how mallards regulate the kinematics with which they land on water and what kinematics they actually do land on water. And we've looked at whether they're shifting their response to the presence or absence of ducks in the area. So again, to look at this real quick, mallards are using the same tau dot constant strategy that we've seen, but they might have a higher tau dot, which might be suggestive of them actually decelerating less than a lot of these other landing behaviors. This could be a feature of the substrate of water in this case, which can absorb more of these impact forces. In addition, if we think of kinematics, we can see that just very simply, the ranges at which mallards are landing on water is fairly different from what we see in perch landings and pigeons. We tend to be a little faster and shallower. However, when we look at these key kinematics that we can extract out of mallard landing behavior, we also see that horizontal velocity is really the primary driver of distance after impact, or the representative to some degree of those forces of impact that the bird might be experiencing. And also that there are some potential consistent kinematic profiles that the birds may carry out, which may be in response to external factors. But again, these mallard landings are largely faster and shallower. And so they seem to be implementing landing kinematics differently if you think about these two first sections. So there are a lot of similarities to perch landing, but the quantitative numbers in which they perform are different despite using the same type of regulatory strategy. When it comes to this idea of them adjusting relative to external factors, so I'll highlight this again, we really do see a difference here in the shuffle and random, suggests that there is something emergent out of this feature that prevents them from having as many potential collisions with the waterfowl in the area. And so these landing patterns are avoiding that situation. But it is not clear if this is due to the mallard that is landing or other emergent factors. So with that, I would just like to take a moment to thank everyone who has been with me through this long roundabout thing, all of the committee members I have had, both past and present. I also would like to give a special thanks to both the Soha Lab and the Phillips Lab, and special thanks to John, Mike, Isaac, and Talia, who've helped a great deal with various forms of lots of the different projects I've worked on. I also would like to highlight two undergraduate researchers, Terrell and Ira, who spent a ton of time at the pond with me working and also helped with some of the digitization. But the manual labor, lugging a bunch of camera equipment out to the pond to record these ducks was a huge boon and a huge help. Also, of course, my wife, my family, and friends old and new who have been an incredible support structure through all of this. And then last, may the 4th be with you.
All right, thank you very much, Jack. We're now happy to take questions from the audience, and then after that, I'll take a quick photo, and then we'll move on to the committee portion of the defense. So questions from the audience.
Jack, I have a question about wind speeds and water surface properties of the pond. Anything that you see there?
Yeah, so we actually actively avoided high wind speeds in this situation. So all of these landings are below wind conditions of about 2.8 meters per second, I believe is the value. And so we just wanted to avoid that in this situation. There is some evidence from other literature that wind speeds can definitely affect their behavior. And I can even anecdotally attest to it at the pond, because the area that we were filming in, if the wind was blowing towards us from the side of the other side of the pond where the ducks normally come, they would rarely actually fly in. They would just swim across the whole pond. And so they don't like to land with the wind at their back. There definitely, it does seem to be evidence of them preferring to land into the wind if they have the option, which some other literature has suggested.
And how are they estimating tau?
In
Visual optic flow measure?
Oh, in this case, we're just pulling instant velocity. So as they come in, we're looking at the instant velocity in the X direction for these landings. So.
Other questions?
Jack,
Yeah.
you said that most of the other data comes from lab studies. Do
Yeah.
you think that some of the difference you're seeing to the pigeon data and things like that could be contributed to observing it in the wild?
Yes, I do actually. I think there's definitely a degree. I think the degree of difference we see probably can't be fully accounted by that, but I'm sure that perch landing behavior is more variable than what's currently documented in the literature because it is all laboratory based. Yeah. But I mean, if you do even some of the math just based on impact speeds of the mallards compared to pigeons and plug in like average math, the momentum of mallard is hitting the water with is an order of magnitude higher than the maximum velocity seen for a pigeon landing on a perch. So like there's a pretty significant difference there that I think probably will not completely disappear if you have some more data from field work on perches, but I'm sure that there is some additional variation within that, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Jack. Very nice presentation, first of all. But I have a question about, there seemed to be a lot of variation in the like landing phase distance between all of these different 177 landings you have. Do you think this has an effect on the tau dot, or do you think this is just simply a product of the features of the environment, where some landing phases are going to be much longer and some will be much shorter just based on the geography? Or is there something more to it than that?
I think it might. It's hard to tell in this data, but I do think there's a chance, for instance, that because we have a variation of landings here, which a number are from within the pond on the other side coming to us in various ways, but some are coming from not at the pond at all. And so the initial velocities some of those landings have are dramatically different. And so if the birds are actively working to not have to break as much, then I think these shorter landings may have higher taus because they don't have higher velocities they need to drop as much, right? And so that may be a feature of that. The problem we run into is all of those shorter tracks, because we just have cameras out in the field, are not necessarily birds that are short flights. Some of them are, but because it just turns out to be when we can see the bird, a short track in this case does not inherently mean that that is one of those landings.
Here's a slightly off the wall question. Is there any danger of ambush predators, snapping turtles, and so forth? Could you want to land at higher speed to be a less vulnerable target?
Yeah, I don't know. Not that I know of in this area for mallards, but for waterfowl more broadly, that's definitely a possibility.
Yeah,
so
could you
may be
repeat
some
that question
benefit to
again?
that.
I didn't catch all that.
Is there potentially a benefit to landing faster with these higher taus on water? Because if you're skimming faster, it may help you avoid predators under the surface who might try and grab you, essentially. So.
I'll just add my thanks for an excellent talk and enjoyed it. So.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, so if there are no other questions, I'm going to put this in gallery mode, and I want to take a picture of everyone here. So if you're not in your pajamas and you're able to turn on your video camera, if you could do that, that would be great. If you want to keep it off, that's fine too. Once we have everyone, I'll take a photo.
Dan probably needs to hook up his camera again.
It's one more, we can do it. Come on, Dan. Maybe it's too much pressure. Isaac, nice snake, by the way. That's fantastic. Okay, if everyone's ready, smile on count of three. 1, 2, 3. Let me do just one more, okay, one more. Okay, great. So I'd like to thank you all for being here today. So if you could just leave the room, that'd be great. And Isaac, we'll talk to you later. Jack, stay put for a second, and off we go.